Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Free Read Fridays. I am your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're reading some more short story material from Instantiation by Greg Egan. This week's story is called Zero for Conduct, and it is a pretty good one, if it's the one I'm thinking of. Pretty short, so this is going to be a short week this week. I'm pretty sure, anyway. Oh yeah, that is going to be a short one. Okay, well, it'll be fine. There's a couple really cool stories in this one, actually. Can't wait till we get to Seventh Sight. A lot of them are kind of, they feel sort of slice of life-y, if that makes any sense. Which is kind of something that Greg Egan does fairly well, in my opinion. Did we already do the one with the, no? Oh, jeez. This has some dark ones, too. There are some dark, dark stories in this one. It's been a while since I've read through this one. Yeah, but we got some good stuff ahead. It's a short story collection that takes a little while to ramp up. But once we are ramped up, then again, the last one was pretty present. Anyway, yeah, without further ado, I will get cracking. There are a fair number of Middle Eastern place names. I want to say, where are we? Where are we? We're not in Kabul. Anyway, I'll find out where we are. I don't think we're in Afghanistan. We might be in Pakistan. I have to double check. Alrighty. So just give me a sec to water up here, and we'll get cracker-rating. Sorry about that. I took an extra second to check up where we were because I had to flip through a couple pages to get the location. We're in Iran, I believe. Yes, we are in Iran. Or at least that's where we start. Zero for Conduct by Greg Egan. 1. Latifa started the web page loading, then went to make tea. The proxy she used convinced her internet provider that every page she accessed belonged to a compendium of pious aphorisms from uncontroversial octogenarians in Qom, while to the sites themselves she appeared to be a peripatetic American, logging on from Pittsburgh one day and Kansas City the next. Between the sanctions against her true host country and that host's paranoia over the most innocent interactions with the West, these precautions were essential. But they slowed down her already sluggish connection so effectively that she might as well have been rehearsing for a flight to Mars. The sound of boiling water offered a brief respite from the televised football match blaring down from the apartment above. 2-0 in favor of the Black Pearls with 15 minutes left to play. It's looking like victory for the home team here in Salmon Stadium. When the tea had brewed, she served it in a small glass for her grandfather to sip through a piece of hard sugar clenched between his teeth. Latifa sat with him for a while, but he was listening to the shortwave radio, straining to hear Kabul through the hum of interference and the breathless commentary coming through the ceiling, and he barely noticed when she left. Back in her room after 15 minutes, she found the scratched screen of the laptop glistening with a dozen shiny ball-and-stick models of organic molecules. Reading the color coding of the atoms was second nature to her by now. White for hydrogen, black for carbon, cherry red for oxygen, azure for nitrogen. Here and there a yellow sulfur atom or a green chlorine stood out, like a chickpea in a barrel of candy. All the molecules that the chem factor page had assigned to her were nameless, unless you counted the formal structural descriptions full of cis-1, 3-dimethyl this, and 2,5-ditert-butyl that, and Latifa had no idea which, if any of them, had actually been synthesized in a lab somewhere. Perhaps a few of them were impossible beasts, chimeras cranked out by the software's mindless permutations, destined to be completely unstable in reality. If she made an effort, she could probably weed some of them out. But that could wait until she'd narrowed down the list of candidates, eliminating the molecules with no real chance of binding strongly to the target. The target this time was an oligosacchαρide, a carbohydrate with 9 rings arranged in pleasantly asymmetric tiers, like a small child's attempt to build a shoe rack. Helpfully, the chem factor page kept it fixed on the screen as Latifa scrolled up and down through the long catalog of its potential suitors. She trusted the software to have made some sensible choices already, on geometric grounds. All of these molecules ought to be able to nestle reasonably snugly against the target. In principle, she could rotate the ball and stick models any way she liked, and slide the target into the same view to access the prospective fit, but in practice that made the laptop's graphics card choke. So she'd learned to manipulate the structures in her head, to picture the encounter without fretting too much about precise angles and distances. Molecules weren't rigid, and if the interaction with the target liberated enough energy, the participants could stretch or flex a little to accommodate each other. I'm going to reread that sentence because I mangled it. I lost track of where I was partway through, and my mouth just kept on rolling. I think I got all the words right, but the emphasis wasn't where I would have liked it to be. Molecules weren't rigid, and if the interaction with the target liberated enough energy, the participants could stretch or flex a little to accommodate each other. There were rigorous calculations that could predict the upshot of all that give and take, but the equations could not be solved quickly or easily. So, Chem Factor invited people to offer their hunches. Newcomers guessed no better than random. Newcomers guessed no better than random, and many players' hit rates failed to rise above statistical noise. But some people acquired a feel for the task, learning from their victories and mistakes, even if they couldn't put their private algorithms into words. Latifa didn't overthink the puzzle, and in 20 minutes she'd made her choice. She clicked the button beside her selection and confirmed it, satisfied that she'd done her best. After 3 years in the game, she'd proved to be a born chemical matchmaker, but she didn't want it going to her head. Whatever lay behind her well-judged guesses, it could only be a matter of time before the software itself learned to codify all the same rules. The truth was, the more successful she became, the faster she'd be headed for obsolescence. She needed to make the most of her talent while it still counted. Latifa spent Oh, did I just skip something? Oh, no, there it is. Sorry. Latifa spent 2 hours on her homework, then a call came from her cousin Fashard in Kandahar. She went out to the balcony where the phone could get a better signal. "How is your grandfather?" he asked. "He's fine. I'll ask him to call you back tomorrow." Her grandfather had given up on the shortwave and gone to bed. "How are things there?" "The kids have all come down with something," Fashard reported, "and the power's been off for the last 2 days." 2 days? Latifa felt for her young cousins, sweltering and feverish even without even a fan. "You should get a generator." "Ha! I could get 10. People are practically giving them away." "Why?" "The price of diesel's gone through the roof," Fashard explained. "Blackouts or not, no one can afford to run them." Latifa looked out at the lights of Mashhad. There was nothing glamorous about the concrete tower blocks around her, but the one thing Iran didn't lack was electricity. Kandahar should have been well supplied by the Kajaki Dam, but 2 of the 3 turbines in the hydroelectric plant had been out of service for more than a year, and the drought had made it even harder for the remaining turbine to meet demand. "What about the shop?" she asked. "Pedaling the sewing machine keeps me fit," Fashard joked. "I wish I could do something." "Things are hard for everyone," Fashard said stoically, "but we'll be all right. People always need clothes. You just concentrate on your studies." Latifa tried to think of some news to cheer him up. "Amir said he's planning to come home this Eid." Her brother had made no firm promises, but she couldn't believe he'd spend the holidays away from his family for a second year in a row. "Inshallah," Fashard replied. "He should book the ticket early, though, or he'll never get a seat." "I'll remind him." There was no response. The connection had cut out. Latifa tried calling back, but all she got was a sequence of strange beeps, as if the phone tower was too flustered to offer up its usual recorded apologies. She tidied the kitchen, then lay in bed. It was hard to fall asleep when her thoughts cycled endlessly through the same inventory of troubles, but some time after midnight she managed to break the loop and tumble into blackness. "Afghani slut," Gamze whispered, leaning against Latifa and pinching her arm through the fabric of her manteau. "Let go of me," Latifa pleaded. She was pressed against her locker. She couldn't pull away. Gamze turned her face toward her, smiling, as if they were friends exchanging gossip. Other students walked past, averting their eyes. "I'm getting tired of the smell of you," Gamze complained. "You're stinking up the whole city. You should go back home to your little mud hut." Latifa's skin tingled between the girl's blunt talons, warmed by broken blood vessels, numbed by clamped nerves. It would be satisfying to lash out with her fists and free herself, but she knew that could only end badly. "Did they have soap in your village?" Gamze wondered. "Did they have underwear? All these things must have been so strange to you when you arrived in civilization." Latifa waited in silence. Arguing only prolonged the torment. "Too stuck up to have a conversation?" Gamze released her arm and began to move away, but then she stopped to give Latifa a parting smile. "You think you're impressing the teachers when you give them all the answers they want? Don't fool yourself, slut. They know you're just an animal doing circus tricks." So, Gamze is real nice. She's just a charmer. When Latifa had cleared away the dinner plates, her grandfather asked her about school. "You're working hard?" He pressed her, cross-legged on the floor with a cushion at his back. "Earning their respect?" "Yes." "And your heart is still set on engineering?" He sounded doubtful, as if for him the word could only conjure up images of rough men covered in machine oil. "Chemical engineering," she corrected him gently. "I'm getting good grades in chemistry, and there'd be plenty of jobs in it." "After 5 more years, after university?" "Yes." Latifa looked away. Half the money Amir sent back from Dubai was already going to her school fees. Her brother was 21. No one could expect him to spend another 5 years without marrying. "You should get on with your studies, then." Her grandfather waved her away amiably, then reached over for the radio. In her room, Latifa switched on the laptop before opening her history book, but she kept her eyes off the screen until she'd read half the chapter on the Sassanid kings. When she finally gave herself a break, the Chem Factor site had loaded, and she'd been logged in automatically, by Cookie. A yellow icon of a stylized envelope was flashing at the top of the page. A fellow player she'd never heard of, called Jessie409, had left her a message, congratulating Phase Change Girl on a cumulative score that had just crossed 20,000. Latifa's true score was far higher than that, but she'd changed her identity and rejoined the game from scratch 5 times so far, lest she come to the notice of someone with the means to find out who she really was. The guess she'd made the previous night had paid off. A rigorous model of the two molecules showed that the binding between them was stable. She had saved one of Chem Factor's clients the time and expense of doing the same calculations for dozens of alternatives, and her reward was a modest fraction of the resources she'd effectively freed. Chem Factor would model any collection of atoms and molecules she liked, free of charge, up to a preset quota in computing time. Latifa closed her history book and moved the laptop to the center of her desk. If the binding problems were easy for her now, when it came to the much larger challenge she'd set herself. Oh boy, howdy! I don't know how to read. I don't know what's going on today. If the binding problems were easy for her now, when it came to the much larger challenge she'd set herself, the instincts what? If the binding problems were easy for her now, space, when it came to the much larger challenge she'd set herself, the instincts she'd honed on the site could only take her so far. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble with this. Yeah, no, I know how to read this sentence. My brain just won't do it. Cool. If the problems were easy for her now, when it came to the much larger challenge she'd set herself, the instincts she'd honed on the site could only take her so far. The raw computing power that she acquired from these sporadic prizes let her test her hunches and see where they fell short. She dug out the notebook from her backpack and reviewed her sketches and calculations. She understood the symmetries of crystals, the shifts and rotations that brought any regular array of atoms back into perfect agreement with itself. She understood the thrillingly strange origins of the different varieties of magnetism, where electrons' spins became aligned or opposed, sometimes through their response to each other's magnetic fields, but more often through the exclusion principle, which linked the alignment of spin to the average distance between the particles, and hence the energy they needed in order to overcome electrostatic repulsion. And after studying hundreds of examples, she believed she had a sense for the kind of crystal that lay in a transition zone where one type of magnetism, where one type of magnetism was on the verge of shifting to another. I don't know why I thought that said magneticism. I'm weird. Doing these live has its disadvantages. She'd sketched her ideal crystal in the notebook more than a year before, but she had no proof yet that it was anything more than a fantasy. Her last modeling run had predicted something achingly close, but it had still not produced what she needed. She had to go back one step and try something different. Latifa retrieved the saved data from that last attempt and set the parameters for the new simulation. She resisted the urge to stab the "confirm" button twice. The response was just taking its time, weaving its way back to her through the maze of obfuscation. Estimated time for run, approximately 7 hours. She sat gazing at the screen for a while, though she knew that if she waited for the prediction to be updated, she'd probably find that the new estimate was even longer. Reluctantly, she moved the laptop to the floor and returned to the faded glory of the Sassanids. She had to be patient. She'd have her answer by morning. Hur, Gamze muttered as Latifa hurried past her to her desk. "You're 10 minutes late, Latifa," Ms. Keshavars declared irritably. "I'm very sorry." Latifa stood in place, her eyes cast down. "So, what's your excuse?" Latifa remained silent. "If you overslept," Ms. Keshavars suggested, "you should at least have the honesty to say so." Latifa had woken at 5, but she managed a flush of humiliation that she hoped would pass for a kind of tacit admission. Let's try that again. Latifa had woken at 5, but she managed a flush of humiliation that she hoped would pass for a kind of tacit admission. 2 hours of detention, then, Miss Keshavars ruled. "It might have been half that if you'd been more forthcoming. Take your seat, please." The day passed at a glacial speed. Latifa did her best to distract herself with the lessons, but it was like trying to chew water. The subject made no difference. History, literature, mathematics, physics. As soon as one sentence was written on the blackboard, she knew exactly what would follow. In detention with 4 other girls, she sat copying pages of long-winded homilies. From her seat she could see a driveway that led out from the staff car park, and one by one the vehicles she most needed to depart passed before her eyes. The waiting grew harder than ever, but she knew it would be foolish to act too soon. 80 minutes into her punishment, she started holding her breath for ever longer intervals. By the time she raised her hand, there was nothing feigned in her tone of discomfort. The supervising teacher, Ms. Shirazi, raised no objections and played no sadistic games with her. Latifa fled the room with plausible haste. The rest of the school appeared deserted. The extra time had been worth it. Latifa opened the door to the toilets and let it swing shut, leaving the sound echoing back down the corridor, then hurried toward the chemistry lab. The students' entrance was locked, but Latifa steeled herself and turned into the warren of storerooms and cubicles that filled the north side of the science wing. Her chemistry teacher, Ms. Daneshvar, had taken her to her desk once to consult an old university textbook, to settle a point on which they'd both been unsure. Latifa found her way back to that desk. The keys were hanging exactly where she remembered them, on labeled pegs. She took the one for the chemistry lab and headed for the teacher's entrance. As she turned the key in the lock, her stomach convulsed. To be expelled would be disastrous enough, but if the school pressed criminal charges, she could be imprisoned and deported. She closed her eyes for a moment, summoning up an image of the beautiful lattice that the chem factor simulation had shown her. For a week she'd thought of nothing else. The software had reached its conclusion, but in the end the only test that mattered was whether the substance could be made in real life. Late afternoon sunlight slanted across the room, glinting off the tubular legs of the stools standing upside down on the black painted benches. All the ingredients Latifa needed, salts of copper, barium, and calcium, sat on the alphabetized shelves that ran along the eastern wall. None were of sufficient value or toxicity to be kept locked away, and she wouldn't need much of any of them for a proof of principle. She took down the jars and weighed out a few grams of each, quantities too small to be missed. She'd written down the masses that would yield the right stoichiometry, yes,
Stoichiometry, stoichiometry, I believe. I haven't seen that word in ages. It has been a long time since I took chemistry. She'd written down the masses that would yield the right stoichiometry, the right proportions of atoms in the final product. But having spent the whole day repeating the calculations in her head, she didn't waste time now consulting the slip of paper. Latifa mixed the brightly colored granules in a ceramic crucible and crushed them with a pestle. Then she placed the crucible in the electric furnace. The heating profile she'd need was complicated, but though she'd only ever seen the furnace operated manually in class, she'd looked up the model number on the net and found the precise requirements for scripting it. When she pushed the memory stick into the USB port, the green light above flickered for a moment. Then the first temperature of the sequence appeared on the display. The whole thing would take 9 hours. Latifa quickly reshelved the jars, binned the filter paper she'd used on the scales, then retreated, locking the door behind her. On her way past the toilets, she remembered to stage a creaking exit. She slowed her pace as she approached the detention room, and felt cold beads of sweat on her face. Miss Shirazi offered her a sympathetic frown before turning back to the magazine she'd been reading. Latifa dreamed that the school was on fire. The blaze was visible from the balcony of her apartment, and her grandfather stood and watched, wheezing alarmingly from the toxic fumes that were billowing out across Mashhad. As he switched on the radio, a newsreader reported that the police had found a memory stick beside the point of ignition and were checking all the students for a fingerprint match. Latifa woke before dawn and ate breakfast, then prepared lunch for the two of them. She'd thought she'd been moving silently, but her grandfather surprised her as she was opening the front door. "Why are you leaving so early?" he demanded. "There's a study group." "What do you mean?" "A few of us get together before classes start and go over the lessons from the day before," she said. "So you're running your own classes now? Do the teachers know about this?" "The teachers approve," Latifa assured him. "It's their lessons that we're revising. We're not just making things up." "You're not talking politics?" he asked sternly. Latifa understood. He was thinking of the discussion group her mother had joined at Kabul University, its agenda excitedly recounted in one of the letters she'd sent him. He'd allowed Latifa to read the whole trove of letters when she'd turned 14, the age her mother had been when he'd gone into exile. "You know me," Latifa said. "Politics is over my head." "All right." He was mollified now. "Enjoy your study." He kissed her goodbye. As Latifa dismounted from her bicycle, she could see that the staff car park was empty except for the cleaner's van. If she could bluff her way through this final stage, she might be out of danger in a matter of minutes. The cleaners had unlocked the science wing, and a woman was mopping the floor by the main entrance. I don't know where I got elevator from. The cleaners had unlocked the science wing, and a woman was mopping the floor by the main entrance. Latifa nodded to her, then walked in as if she owned the place. "Hey, you shouldn't be here!" The woman straightened up and glared at her, worried for her job should anything be stolen. "Mr. Neshavar asked me to prepare something for the class. She gave me the key yesterday." Latifa held it up for inspection. The woman squinted at the key, then waved her on, muttering unhappily. In the chemistry lab, everything was as Latifa had left it. She plucked the memory stick from the port on the furnace, then switched off the power. She touched the door and felt no residual heat. When she opened the furnace, the air that escaped smelled like sulfur and bleach. Gingerly, she lifted out the crucible and peered inside. A solid gray mass covered the bottom, its surface as smooth as porcelain. The instruments she needed to gauge success or failure were all in the physics lab, and trying to talk her way into another room right now would attract too much suspicion. She could wait for her next physics class and see what opportunities arose. Students messed around with the digital multimeters. Students messed around with the digital multimeters all the time, and if she was caught sticking the probes into her pocket, her teacher would see nothing but a silly girl trying to measure the electrical resistance of a small paving stone she'd picked up off the street. Miss Hashemi wouldn't be curious enough to check the properties of the stone for herself. Latifa fetched a piece of filter paper. I don't know. I'm having like brain to mouth dyslexia here. It seems to be getting worse. Latifa fetched a piece of filter paper and tried to empty the crucible onto it, but the gray material clung stubbornly to the bottom where it had formed. She tapped it gently, then more forcefully, to no avail. She was going to have to steal the crucible. It was not an expensive piece of equipment, but there were only 4, neatly lined up in a row in the cupboard below the furnace, and its absence would eventually be missed. But Miss Daneshvar might, just might, ask the cleaners if they'd seen it. There was a chance that all her trespasses would be discovered. But what choice did she have? She could leave the crucible behind and hunt for a replacement in the city. At the risk that, in the meantime, someone would take the vessel out to use it, find it soiled, and discard it. At the risk that she'd be caught trying to make the swap. And all of this for a gray lump that might easily be as worthless as it looked. Latifa had bought a simple instrument of her own in the bazaar 6 months before, and she'd brought it with her almost as a joke, something she could try once she was out of danger, with no expectations at all. If the result it gave her was negative, that wouldn't really prove anything. But she didn't know what else she could use to guide her. She fished the magnet out of the pocket of her manteau. It was a slender disc the size of her thumbnail, probably weighing a gram or so. She held it in the mouth of the crucible and lowered it toward the bottom. If there was any force coming into play as the magnet approached the gray material, it was too weak for her to sense. With a couple of millimeters still separating the two, Latifa spread her fingers and let the magnet drop. She didn't hear it strike the bottom, but from such a height, how loud would it have been? She took her fingers out of the crucible and looked down. It was impossible to tell if it was touching or not. The view was too narrow, the angle too high. Latifa could hear the woman with the mop approaching, getting ready to clean the chemistry lab. Within a minute or less, everything she did here would take place in front of a witness. A patch of morning sunlight from the eastern window fell upon the blackboard behind her. Latifa grabbed an empty Erlenmeyer flask and held it in the beam, tilting it until she managed to refract some light down into the crucible. As she turned the flask back and forth, shifting the angle of the light, she could see a dark circle moving behind the magnet. Lit from above, an object barely a millimeter high couldn't cast a shadow like that. The magnet was floating on air. The door began to open. Latifa pocketed the crucible. She put the Erlenmeyer flask back on its shelf, then turned to see the cleaner eyeing her suspiciously. "I'm all done now, thanks," Latifa announced cheerfully. She motioned toward the staff entrance. "I'll put the key back on my way out." Minutes later, Latifa strode out of the science wing. She reached into her pocket and wrapped her hand around the crucible. She still had some money Amir had given her last Eid. Eid. I don't know how that's pronounced. E-I-D? It's a holiday. I feel like I should know that pronunciation, but I don't, off the top of my head. Last Eid. She could buy a replacement that afternoon. For now, all she had to do was get through the day's lessons with a straight face, while walking around carrying the world's first room-temperature superconductor. It's only slightly a big deal. Only a little bit of a big deal. Science! 2. Izzatullah was said to be the richest Afghani in Mashhad, and from the look of his 3-story marble-clad house he had no wish to live down that reputation. Latifa had heard that he'd made his money in Saudi Arabia, where he'd represented the Mujahideen at the time of the Soviet occupation. Wealthy Saudi women with guilty consciences had filed through his office day after day, handing him bags full of gold bullion to help fund the jihad, buying, they believed, the same promise of paradise that went to the martyrs themselves. Izzatullah, being less concerned with the afterlife, had passed on their donations to the war chest but retained a sizable commission. At the mansion's gate, Latifa's grandfather paused. "I promised your mother I'd keep you out of trouble." Latifa didn't know how to answer that. His caution came from love and grief, but this was a risk they needed to take. Fashard's already started things rolling on his side, she reminded him. It will be hard on him if we pull out now. That's true. In the sitting room, Izzatullah's youngest daughter, Yasmin, served tea, then stayed with Latifa while the two men withdrew to talk business. Latifa passed the time thinking up compliments for each rug and item of furniture in sight, and Yasmin replied in such a soft, shy voice that Latifa had no trouble eavesdropping on the conversation from the adjoining room. "My nephew owns a clothing business in Kandahar," her grandfather began. "Some tailoring, some imports and exports. But recently he came across a new opportunity, a chance to buy electrical cable at a very fair price." "A prudent man will have diverse interests," Izzatullah declared approvingly. "We're hoping to onsell the wire in Mashhad," her grandfather explained. "We could avoid a lot of paperwork at the border if we packed the trucks with cartons labeled as clothing, with some of the rear bearing out that claim. My granddaughter could run a small shop to receive these shipments." "And you're seeking a partner to help fund this venture?" Latifa heard the rustle of paper, the figures she'd prepared changing hands. "What's driven you to this, Haji?" Izzatullah asked pointedly. "You don't have a reputation as a businessman." "I'm 70 years old," her grandfather replied. "I need to see my daughter's children looked after before I die." Izzatullah thought for a while. "Let me talk to my associates in Kandahar." "Of course." On the bus back to the apartment, Latifa imagined the phone calls that would already be bouncing back and forth across the border. Izzatullah would soon know all about the new electrification project in Kandahar, which aimed to wire up a dozen more neighborhoods to the already struggling grid, apparently in the hope that even a meager ration of cheap power would turn more people against the insurgents who bombed every convoy that tried to carry replacement parts to the hydroelectric plant. International donors had agreed to fund the project, and with overhead cables strung from pole to pole along winding roads, some discrepancy between the surveyed length and the cable used was only to be expected. But while Fashard really had come to an agreement with the contractor to take the excess wire off his hands, with no family ties or prior connection to the man, he had only managed to secure the deal by offering a price well above the going rate. Latifa didn't expect any of these details to elude their partner, but the hope was that his advisers in Kandahar would conclude that Fashard, lacking experience as a smuggler, had simply underestimated his own costs. That alone wouldn't make the collaboration a bad investment. She'd structured the proposal in such a way that Izzatullah would still make a tidy return, even if the rest of them barely broke even. They left the bus and made their way home. "If we told him the truth," her grandfather began as they started up the stairs. "If we told him the truth, he'd snatch it from our hands," Latifa retorted. Her words echoed in the concrete stairwell. She lowered her voice. One way or another, he'd get a hold of the recipe, then sell it to some company with 1,000 lawyers who could claim they'd invented it themselves. We need to be in a stronger position before we take this to anyone, or they'll eat us alive. A patent attorney could do a lot to protect them before they approached a commercial backer, but that protection would cost several thousand euros. Raising that much themselves, without trading away any share in the invention, wasn't going to be easy, but it would make all the difference to how much power they retained. Her grandfather stopped on a landing to catch his breath. And if Ayatollah finds out we've lied to him? His phone buzzed once, with a text message. You need to go to the house again, he said, tomorrow after school. Latifa's skin prickled with fear. Me? What for? Did Ayatollah want to quiz her about her knowledge of retail fashion for the modern Iranian woman, or had his digging already exposed her other interests? Most of the money's going straight to Fashard, but we'll need some cash at our end, too, her grandfather explained. He doesn't want me coming and going from the house, but no one will be suspicious if you've struck up a friendship with his daughter. Latifa had asked the electricians to come at 7 to switch on the power to the kilns, but when they hadn't shown up by 8, she gave up any hope of making it to her history class. For the first hour, she'd killed time by sweeping. Now she paced the bare wooden floor, optimistically surveying her new fiefdom. Finding the factory had been a huge stroke of luck. It had originally produced ceramic tableware, and when the tenants went out of business, the owner of the premises had taken possession of the kilns. He'd been on the verge of selling them for scrap, and had parted with them for a ridiculously low price, just to get her grandfather to sign the lease. The location wasn't perfect, but perhaps it was for the best that it wasn't too close to the shop. The separation would make it less likely that anyone would see her in both places. When the electricians finally arrived, they ignored Latifa completely, and she resisted the urge to pester them with odd questions. What would you do if you cut into an overhead power line and found that its appearance, in cross-section, wasn't quite what you were used to? Delivery for Boss Ceramics? A man called from the entrance. Latifa went to see what it was. The courier was already loading one box, as tall as she was, onto his trolley. She guided him across the factory floor. Can you put it here? Thank you. There are another 2 in the truck. She waited until the electricians had left before finding a knife and slicing away the cardboard and styrofoam, afraid that they might recognize the equipment and start asking questions of their own. She plugged in one of the cable winders and put it through a test sequence, watching the nimble motorized arms blur as they rehearsed on thin air. One machine would unpick while the other 2 wove, and for every kilometer of cable that came into the factory, 2 kilometers would emerge. With half as many strands as the original, the new version would need to be bulked out from within to retain the same diameter. The pellets of ceramic wound in among the steel and aluminum wouldn't form a contiguous electrical path, but these superconducting inclusions would still lower the overall resistance of the cable, sharing the current for a large enough portion of its length to compensate for the missing metal. So long as the cable was fit for use, the Iranian contractors who bought it would have no reason to complain. They'd pocket the difference in price, and the power grid would be none the worse for it. Everyone would get paid. Everyone would be happy. Latifa checked her watch. She'd missed another 2 classes. All she could do now was write the whole day off and claim to have been sick. She needed to chase down the heat-resistant molds that would give the ceramic pellets their shape, and try again to get a promise from the chemical suppliers that they could deliver the quantities she was going to need to keep the kilns going day after day, week after week. Do you have this in size 16? The woman asked, emerging from the changing room. Latifa looked up from her homework. The woman was still wearing the oversized sunglasses that she hadn't deigned to remove as she entered the shop, as if she were a famous singer afraid of being mobbed by fans. I'm sorry, we don't. Can you check your storeroom? I love the colors, but this one is a bit too tight. Latifa hesitated. She was certain that they didn't stock the blouse in that size, but it would be impolite to refuse. Of course, one moment. She spent half a minute rummaging through the shelves to ensure that her search didn't seem too perfunctory. It was almost 6 o'clock. She should close the shop and relieve her grandfather at the factory. When she returned to the counter, the customer had left. The woman had taken the blouse, along with 2 pairs of trousers from the rack near the door. Latifa felt a curious warmth rising in her face. Most of all, she was annoyed that she'd been so gullible, but the resentment she felt at the brazen theft collided unpleasantly with other thoughts. There was nothing to be done but to put the incident out of her mind. She looked over her unfinished essay on the Iran-Iraq War. It was due in the morning, but she'd have to complete it in the factory.
Are these goods from your shop?
A policeman was standing in the doorway. The thief was beside him, and he was holding up the stolen clothes. Latifa could hardly deny it. The trousers were identical to the others hanging right beside him. They are, sir, she replied. He must have seen the woman emerging, hastily stuffing everything into her bag. Why couldn't she have done that out of sight?
This lady says she must have dropped the receipt. Should I look for it, or will I be wasting my time?
Latifa struggled to choose the right answer. It's my fault, sir. She must have thought I'd given her the receipt along with the change. But she was in a hurry. She didn't even want one of our bags.
So you still have the receipt?
Latifa pointed helplessly at the waste paper basket beside the counter, full to the brim with discarded drafts of her essay. I couldn't leave the shop and chase after her, so I threw it in there. Please forgive me, sir. I'm just starting out in this job. If the boss learns what I've done, he'll fire me straight away. It was lucky that the thief was still wearing her ridiculous glasses. Latifa wasn't sure how she would have coped if they'd had to make eye contact. The policeman appeared skeptical. He knew what he'd seen. Latifa put the back of her hand to her eyes and sniffed.
All right, he said. Everyone makes mistakes. He turned to the woman. I'm sorry for a misunderstanding.
It's nothing. She nodded to Latifa. Good evening. The policeman lingered in the doorway, thinking things over. Then he approached the counter.
Let me see your storeroom.
Latifa gestured to the excuse me. Latifa gestured to the entrance, but stayed behind the cash register. She listened to the man moving about, rustling through discarded packaging, tapping the walls. What did he imagine he'd find? A secret compartment? He emerged from the room, stony-faced, as if the lack of anything incriminating only compounded his resentment.
ID card.
Latifa produced it. She'd rid herself of her accent long ago, and she had just enough of her father's Tajik features that she could often pass as an Iranian to the eye. But here it was, the proof of her real status.
Ha!
He grunted.
All right.
He handed back the ID.
Just behave yourself and we'll get along fine.
As he walked out of the shop, Latifa began shaking with relief. He'd found an innocent explanation for her reticence to press charges. The card entitled her to remain in the country at the pleasure of the government, but she wasn't a citizen, and she would have been crazy to risk the consequences if the woman had called her a liar. Latifa wheeled her bicycle out of the storeroom and closed the shop. The factory was 6 kilometers away, and the traffic tonight looked merciless. Anybody who has listened to the stream before, particularly when I was doing the radicalized short story collection by Cory Doctorow, knows that I have a something of a fascination for grassroots stuff like this. So I actually read this before I had Radicalized. When was this published? Radicalized, I think, was 2019, but I didn't get it until like a year or two after that. This short story collection was published in 2020. This story was published in 2013, which sounds about right.
I had a call from Ejatula,
Latifa's grandfather said.
He wants to take over the transport.
Latifa continued brushing down the slides from the superconductor hopper. What does that mean?
He has another partner who's been bringing goods across the border. This man has a warehouse in Herat.
Herat was just 100 kilometers from the border, on the route from Kandahar to Mashhad. So he wants to make room for this other man's merchandise in our trucks? Latifa put the brush down. It was an unsettling prospect, but it didn't have to be a disaster.
No,
Her grandfather replied.
He wants us to bring the wire across in this man's other trucks. Oh, in this other man's trucks.
Why?
The customs inspectors have people coming from Tehran to look over their shoulders,
Her grandfather explained.
There is no fixing that with bribes, and the clothes make too flimsy a cover for the real cargo. This other man's bringing over a couple of loads of scrap metal every week. Hiding the wire won't be a problem for him.
Latifa sat down on the bench beside the winders. But we can't risk that. We can't let him know how many spools we're bringing in. Ejatula had kept his distance from their day-to-day operations, but the black market contacts to whom they passed the altered wire had long-standing connections to him, and Latifa had no doubt that he was being kept apprised of every transaction. Underreporting their sales to hide the fact that they were selling twice as much wire as they imported would be suicidal.
Can we shift this work to Kandahar?
Her grandfather asked. Maybe the last part, the winding, Latifa replied. So long as they could double the wire before it reached Herat, there'd be no discrepancies in the numbers Ejatula received from his informants.
What about the kilns?
No, the power's too erratic. If there's a blackout halfway through a batch, that would ruin it, and we need at least 2 batches a day to keep up.
Couldn't we use a generator?
Latifa didn't have the numbers she needed to answer that, but she knew Fashard had looked into the economics of using one himself. She texted him some questions, and he replied a few minutes later. It's hopeless, she concluded. Each kiln runs at about 20 kilowatts. Getting that from diesel, we'd be lucky to break even. Her grandfather managed a curt laugh.
Maybe we'd be better off selling the rest of the wire as it is?
Latifa did a few more calculations. That won't work either. Fashard is paying too much for it. We'd be making a loss on every spool. After sinking money into the factory's lease and other inputs to the doubling process, any attempt to get by without the benefits of that doubling would leave them owing Ejatula more cash than the remaining sales would bring in.
Then what choice is left to us?
We could keep making the superconductor here, Latifa suggested.
And get it to Kandahar how? Her grandfather protested. Do you think we can do business with anyone working that route and expect Ejatula not to hear about it? Once or twice, maybe, but not if we set up a regular shipment.
Latifa had no answer to that. We should talk about this in the morning, she said. You've been working all day. You should get some sleep now. At her insistence, he retired to the factory's office, where they'd put in a mattress and blankets. Latifa stood by the hopper. The last batch of superconductor should have cooled by now, but she was too dejected to attend to it. If they moved the whole operation to Kandahar, the best they could hope for was scraping through without ending up in debt. She didn't doubt that Fashard and her other cousins would do whatever needed to be done, working unpaid, purely for the sake of keeping her grandfather out of trouble, but the prospect of forcing that burden onto them filled her with shame. Her own dawdling wasn't helping anyone. She put on the heat-proof gloves, took the molds from the kiln, and began filling the hopper. She'd once calculated that if Iran's entire grid were to be replaced with a superconducting version, the power no longer being lost in transmission would be enough to light up all of Afghanistan. But if that was just a fantasy, all her other plans were heading for the same fate. Latifa switched on the winders and watched the strands of wire shuttling from spool to spool, wrapping the stream of pellets from the hopper. Of all the wondrous things the superconductor made possible, this had seemed the simplest, and the safest way to exploit it without attracting too much attention. But these dull gray beads were all she had. If she wanted to rescue the whole misbegotten venture, she needed to find another way to turn them to her advantage. Latifa's grandfather ran from the office, barefoot, eyes wide with fear.
What happened? Are you hurt?
Latifa could see dents in the ceiling where the pellets had struck. "I'm all right," she assured him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." She looked around. The kilns and the winders were untouched, and there was no damage to the building that a plasterer couldn't fix.
What did you do? I thought something exploded, or those machines went crazy.
He glared at the winders, as if they might have rebelled and started pelting their owners with shrapnel. Latifa switched off the power from the outlet and approached what remained of her test rig. She'd surrounded it with workbenches turned on their sides as safety shields. "I'm going to need better reinforcement," she said. "I didn't realize the field would get so strong so quickly." Her grandfather stared at the shattered assembly that she'd improvised from a helix of copper pipe. The previous tenants had left all kinds of junk behind, and Latifa had been loath to discard anything that might have turned out to be useful. "It's a storage device," she explained, "for electricity. The current just sits there going round and round. When you want some of it back, you can draw it out. It's not all that different from a battery."
I'd say it's not all that different from a bomb.
So, yeah, a battery. Pretty much. Latifa was chastened. "I was careless. I'm sorry. I was impatient to see if I could make it work at all. The current generates a strong magnetic field, and that puts the whole thing under pressure. But when it's built properly, it will be a solid coil of superconductor, not a lot of pellets stuffed inside a pipe. And we can bury it in the ground, so if it does shatter, no one will get hurt."
How is this meant to help us?
Her grandfather asked irritably. He lifted his right foot to examine the sole. A splinter of superconductor was poking through the skin. Latifa said, the mains power in Kandahar is unreliable, and it's still far cheaper than using a generator. But it's still far cheaper than using a generator. A few of these storage coils could be enough to guarantee that we can run the kilns through a blackout."
You're serious?
Latifa hesitated. "Give me a few days to do some more experiments. Then we'll know for sure."
How many days of school have you missed already?
"That's not important." Her grandfather sat on the ground and covered his eyes with one hand.
School is not important now? They murdered your mother because she was teaching girls, and your father because he defended her. When she grew so afraid that she sent you to me, I promised her you would get an education. This country is no paradise, but at least you were safe in that school. You were doing well. Now we're juggling money we don't have, living in fear of Ayatollah, blowing things up, planning some new madness every day.
Latifa approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. "After this there'll be nothing to distract me. We'll close the factory, we'll close the shop. My whole life will be school and homework all the way to Eid." Her grandfather looked up at her. It might be Eid.
How long will it take?
"Maybe a couple of weeks." The coils themselves didn't have to be complicated, but it would take some research and trial and error to get the charging and discharging circuitry right.
And then what? he asked. "If we send these things to Kandahar, with the kilns and everything else, do you think Fashard can put it all together and just take over where we left off?"
Maybe not, Latifah conceded. Fashard had wired his own house, and he could repair a sewing machine blindfolded. But this would be tricky, and she couldn't talk him through the whole setup on the phone. She said, "It looks like Eid's coming early for me this year." Must be Eid. Never mind, it's Eid. Okay, sorry. I am showing my lack of worldliness. I figured I'd look it up real quick. Fashard was waiting for Latifah in the bus station. He spotted her before she saw him. Or rather, he spotted the bright scarf, chosen from the range she sold in the shop, that she'd told him she'd be tying to the handle of her suitcase. He called out, then approached her, beaming. "Welcome, cousin! How was your trip?" He grabbed the suitcase and hefted it onto his shoulders. It did have wheels, but in the crowded station, any baggage at foot level would just be an impediment. "It was fine," she said. "You're looking well." Actually, Fashard looked exhausted, but he'd put so much enthusiasm into his greeting that it would have been rude not to mention anything of the kind. Oh, sorry. Actually, Fashard looked exhausted, but he'd put so much enthusiasm into his greeting that it would have been rude to mention anything of the kind. Latifah followed him to the car, bumping into people along the way. She still hadn't adjusted to having her peripheral vision excised. The sun was setting as they drove through the city. Latifah fought to keep her eyes open, but she took in an impression of peeling advertising posters, shabby whitewashed buildings, crowds of men in all manner of clothing, and a smattering of women in near-identical garb. Traffic police stood at the busiest intersections, blowing their whistles. Nothing had changed. Inside the house, she gratefully shed her burqa as Fashard's 5 youngest children swarmed toward her. She dropped to her knees to exchange kisses and dispense sweets. Fashard's wife, Soraya, his mother, Zora, eldest daughter, sister, brother-in-law, and 2 nephews were next to greet her. Latifah's weariness lifted. Used as she was to comparative solitude, the sense of belonging was overpowering. "How is my brother?" Zora pressed her. "He's fine. He sends his love to you especially." Zora started weeping. Fashard put an arm around her. Latifah looked away. Her grandfather still had too many enemies here to be able to return. When Latifah had washed and changed her clothes, she rejoined the family just as the first dizzying aromas began escaping from the kitchen. She had fasted all day and the night before, knowing that on her arrival she was going to be fed until she burst. Soraya shooed her away from the kitchen, but Latifah was presently Soraya shooed her away from the kitchen, but Latifah was pleasantly surprised. Fashard had finally improved the chimney to the point where the wood-fired stove no longer filled the room with blinding smoke. As they ate by the light of the kerosene lamps, everyone had questions for her about life in Mashhad. What did things cost now, with the new sanctions in place? What were her neighbors like? How were the Iranians treating Afghanis these days? Latifah was happy to answer them, but as she looked around at the curious faces, she kept thinking of 8-year-old Fatima, tugging on her sleeve, accepting a sweet but demanding something more. "What was school like? What did you learn?" In the morning, Fashard showed Latifah the room he'd set aside for their work. She'd set the kilns, the winders, and the current buckets to him by 3 different carriers. Fashard had found a source for the superconductor precursors himself, a company that brought in a variety a company that brought a variety of common industrial chemicals in through Pakistan. It was possible that news of some of these shipments had reached Ejatula, but Latifa was hoping that it wouldn't be enough to attract suspicion. If Fashard had decided to diversify into pottery, that hardly constituted a form of betrayal. The room opened onto the courtyard, and Fashard had already taken up the paving stones to expose a patch of bare ground. "This is perfect," Latifa said. "We can run some cable out along the wall and bury the current buckets right here." Fashard examined one of the halved diving cylinders she'd adapted to the purpose. "This really might burst?" he asked, more bemused than alarmed. "I hope not," Latifa replied. "There's a cutoff switch that should stop the charger if the magnetic field grows too strong. I can't imagine that switch getting jammed. A bit of grit or friction isn't going to hold the contacts together against a force that's threatening to tear the whole thing apart. But so long as you keep track of the charging time, there shouldn't be a problem anyway." It took a couple of hours to dig the holes and wire up the storage system. Late in the morning, the power came on, giving them a chance to test everything before they covered the buckets with half a meter of soil. Latifa switched on the charger and waited 10 minutes. Then she plugged a lamp into the new supply. The light it produced was steadier and brighter than it had emitted when connected to the mains. The voltage from the buckets was better regulated than the incoming supply. Fashard smiled, not quite believing it. The largest of the components inside the cylinders looked like nothing so much as the element of an electric water heater. That was how Latifa had described the ceramic helices in the customs documents. "If everyone had these," he began enthusiastically, but then he stopped and thought it through. "If everyone had them, every household would be drawing more power, charging up their buckets to use through the blackouts. The power company would only be able to meet the demand from an even smaller portion of its customers, so they'd have to make the rationing periods even shorter." "That's true," Latifa agreed, "which is why it will be better if the buckets are sold with solar panels."
What about in winter?
Fashard protested. Latifa snorted.
"What do you want from me? Magic? The government needs to fix the hydro plant."
Fashard shook his head sadly.
The people who keep bombing it aren't going to stop, not unless they're given everything they want.
Latifa felt tired, but she had to finish what she'd started. She said,
"I should show you how to work the kilns and the winders."
It took 3 days for Latifa and Fashard to settle on a procedure for the new factory. If they waited for the current buckets to be fully charged before starting the kilns, that guaranteed they could finish the batch without spoiling it. But they could make better use of the time if they took a risk and started earlier, given that the power, erratic though it was, usually did stay on for a few hours every day. Fashard brought in his oldest nephew, Nakib, who'd been working half the shifts. Latifa stayed out of these training sessions. Nakib was always perfectly polite to her, but she knew he wasn't prepared to be shown anything by a woman 3 years younger than himself. Sidelined, Latifa passed the time with Fatima. Though it was too dangerous for Fatima to go to school, it's Fatema. I'm guessing that's Fatima. Though it was too dangerous for Fatima to go to school, Fashard had taught her to read and write, and he was trying to find someone to come and tutor her. Latifa sat beside her as she proudly sounded out the words in a compendium of Pashtun folk tales, and practiced her script in the back of Latifa's notebook.
"What are these?"
Fatema asked, flicking through the pages of calculations. Al-Jabr, Latifa replied.
"You'll understand when you're older."
Al-Jabr. I'm not sure of the pronunciation on that, and I'm not actually sure what it is. I'll look it up later. I'm just writing a note to look it up. One day they were in the courtyard, racing the remote control cars that Latifa had brought from Mashhad for all the kids to share. The power went off, and as the television the other cousins had been watching fell silent, Fatima turned toward the factory, surprised. She could hear the winders still spinning.
How is that working?
She asked Latifa.
Our cars are still working, aren't they?
Latifa revved her engine. Fatima refused to be distracted.
They use batteries. You can't run anything big with batteries.
Maybe I brought some bigger batteries from Iran.
Show me,
Fatima pleaded. Latifa opened her mouth to start explaining, her mind already groping for some simple metaphors she could use to convey how the current buckets worked. But our cousin came from Iran and buried giant batteries in the ground? Did she really want that story spreading out across the neighborhood?
I was joking,
Latifa said. Fatima frowned.
But then how?
Latifa shrugged. Fatima's brothers, robbed of their cartoons, were heading toward them, demanding to join in the game. The bus station was stifling. Latifa would have been happy to dispense a few parting hugs and then take her seat, but her cousins didn't do quiet farewells.
I'll be back at Eid, she promised, with Amir.
That's months away,
Soraya sobbed.
I'll phone every week.
You say that now?
Zora replied, more resigned than accusing.
I'm not leaving forever. I'll see you all again.
Latifa was growing tearful herself. She squatted down and tried to kiss Fatima, but the girl turned her face away.
What should I bring you from Mashhad next time? Latifa asked her.
Fatima considered this.
The truth,
Latifa said.
I'll try.
"3.
I did my best to argue your case,
Ms. Daneshvar told Latifa.
I told the principal you had too much promise to waste, but your attendance records, your missed assignments.
She spread her hands unhappily.
I couldn't sway them. I'll be all right,
Latifa assured her. She glanced up at the peg that held the key to the chemistry lab.
And I appreciate everything you did for me. But what will you do now?
Latifa reached into her backpack and took out one of the small ceramic pots Fashard had sent her. Not long after the last spools of wire had left Kandahar, 2 men had come snooping on Erjatullah's behalf, perhaps a little puzzled that Fashard didn't seem quite as crushed as the terms of the deal should have left him. He had managed to hide the winders from them, but he'd had to think up an alibi for the kilns at short notice.
I'm going to sell a few knickknacks in the bazaar, Latifa said, like this.
She placed the pot on the desk and made as if to open it. When she'd twisted the lid through a quarter turn, it sprung into the air, only kept from escaping by 3 cotton threads that remained comically taut, restraining it against the push of some mysterious repulsive force. Ms. Daneshvar gazed in horror at this piece of useless kitsch.
Just for a while, Latifa added, until my other plans come to fruition.
Oh, Latifa.
You should take a closer look at it when you have the time,
Latifa urged her.
There's a puzzle to it that I think you might enjoy. There are a couple of magnets, Ms. Daneshvar replied, like pole aimed at like. You were my brightest student, and now you're impressed by this?
She turned the pot over.
Made in Afghanistan, patent pending.
She gave a curt laugh, but then thought better of mocking the idea.
Latifa said, You helped me a lot. It wasn't wasted.
She stood and shook the former teacher's hand.
I hope things go well for you.
Ms. Daneshvar rose and kissed Latifa's cheek.
I know you're resourceful. I know you'll find something. It just should have been so much more.
Latifa started to leave, but then she stopped and turned back. The claims had all been lodged, the details disclosed. She didn't have to keep the secret any more. Cut one thread so you can turn the lid upside down, she suggested. Ms. Daneshvar was perplexed. Why? Latifa smiled. It's a very quick experiment, but I promise you it will be worth it. And that was Zero for Conduct by Greg Egan. I thought it was cute. It's optimistic, it's educational, and it's fun. Not so much sticking it to the man, I guess, but anyway. So a short one this week. Oh, so the Aljaber, also known as the Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing. It's a mathematical treatise on algebra and Arabic. When was it written? Written by the Persian mathematician Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi around 820 CE. 820 CE. Oh, wow. And established algebra as a new area of mathematics. So that's why it's mentioned there. She's trying to say, oh, you know, it's math stuff, which it is, basically. Algebra. Oh, algebra. I just got that. Algebra. Algebra wal muktabala. Mangling, probably, the pronunciation of that, and for that I am sorry. But yeah, so Greg Egan, particularly around that time period, had definitely a Middle Eastern fascination. I don't think he doesn't anymore. I just know he definitely did then. A bunch of good work came out from him that are kind of themed around that. There was one in a previous short story collection I can't remember the name of, but kind of time traveling refugees. An entire book called Zendegi I do kind of recommend. It's very down to earth. So much so that it's almost boring. It's not quite boring. I wouldn't call it boring, but it's quite. Where's my copy of Zendegi? Excuse me? Where are you? Give me a sec. Did I loan it to someone and then forget to get it back? Or is it right there? Nope, that's Diaspora. Ah, there's Zendegi. I thought it was one of the orthogonal books for some reason. I don't know why. Same publisher. Anyway, so yeah, Greg Egan. He's got a new book out that came out last month that I've got to get and read because I'm a fanboy, called Morphotrophic, which is a word I've seen before, but I can't remember in what context offhand. And it's based on the description. It sounds like it's kind of actually sounds like it has ties to one of his more recent short stories, in terms of not a human civilization, but a civilization of sapient beings, people, a civilization of people who are operating on ground rules that are rather different from our own, and just kind of how they interact with their world. Which is kind of a cool thing that he does. He does this frequently, particularly in the last 10 years or so. He does it a lot. I mean, that's basically what the orthogonal trilogy is, the Clockwork Rocket, Arrow of Time trilogy. Is it's like how do relatively normal, if maybe more intelligent and optimistic people than us, how do they interact with their environment when the rules are very different than our own? Just how do they live their lives? How do they avert a crisis that only they would have Dichronauts is an excellent example. I do actually think I want to read Dichronauts on stream at some point because I found it quite entertaining. It's a lot more comprehensible, to me at least, than the Arrow of Time trilogy, the orthogonal trilogy, starting with a clockwork rocket and then working its way along. But I don't have the proper background for that for that one. I have like the barest minimum to understand that there's a lot I don't get. Fortunately, Greg Egan is really cool and has a website that explains quite a lot of his work, gregegan.net. And it's got deliciously old school, functional user interface design. Yes, Morphotrophic that came out, I think, yeah, it was last month. Okay. I still have a bunch of his more recent work I have to get through. I haven't read the Book of All Skies or Scale yet. It's on the list, as well as Sleep and the Soul. I'm hoping this summer I'll get around to that. Anyway, like I've said, I'm a Greg Egan fan. He even says, contact details. My email address can be formed from parts of the URL of this website. Please don't send messages to my agents or to other third parties to pass on to me, and please don't ask me to sign books. Basically, there's someone who very much respects their privacy, and I am 10,000% behind that. Anyway, that will do for now. Does this one have an explanation? I don't think it doesn't really need one. This is probably one of his most, this short story we got through, probably one of his most easily comprehensible ones, which is one of the reasons I like it. At any rate, thank you to everyone who tuned in, if you're out there. If you're tuning into this after the fact and you're wondering why everything is so rough, I do these live, in front of a live studio, well, not a studio audience, whoever's tuning in at the time, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. For 2024, every single one of those days is going to be reading something. I start at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, or East Coast US time, which is UTC minus 8? Oh, geez, am I losing my mind? I can't believe I can't remember this. This is embarrassing. I'm not having a great morning, I guess. I don't know. I had a bunch of stuff I had to do earlier that I got done. EST... UTC offset. UTC minus 5. Why did I think 8? Oh, because I was just having to interact with someone who's... Never mind. I think that's Pacific Coast time. Anyway, UTC minus 5. I should start doing that. That'd be easier, right? Right? Yeah. I'm gonna have to change my my boilerplate. Oh, geez, I don't think I've changed my... So I stream to both Twitch and YouTube. All my stuff's archived on YouTube, which is probably where you're watching this. I don't think I have changed my Twitch stream description thing. Oh, that's gonna be... I'm gonna be so mortified. Channel description saying what I do every day of the week. Are we good? Where's my calendar thing? Oh, I'm gonna be so mad. I'm gonna be so mad. I didn't even... Yes! Oh, I haven't. Oh, that's embarrassing. Yep. Yep. That's why people keep tuning in on Wednesdays at random. Ah. Okay. Well, I'll fix that. Oy. Embarrassment. At any rate, yeah. So Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays. Right now, we are reading through on Fridays, Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. I am reading through in the Instantiation short story collection by Greg Egan. Next week will be which short story? I'm only going to be doing one at a time for now. Uncanny Valley. Ooh, Uncanny Valley is a good one, as I recall. I think this one is about. Which one is this? Oh, is this the? Yeah, I think this is it. This one's interesting. If this is the one I'm thinking of. It's about inheritance. Possibly. I might be thinking of the wrong one. Maybe not. Anyway, we'll find out what it is. I don't remember now. Mondays are Mecha Mondays, where I read something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. Right now, we're reading through Waldo and Magic Incorporated, a science fiction double feature by Robert Heinlein. Waldo is decidedly mecha adjacent, Magic Incorporated less so, but we'll be wrapping that up this week, next week. And then on Wednesdays, right now we're reading through A Hero Born, Legends of the Condor Heroes, Book 1 by Jin Yong, which is a wuxia martial fantasy novel. Extremely influential. If you, at any time in your life, have had a fascination with kung fu movies, Hong Kong kung fu movies, Hong Kong cinema, and dudes running around with cool hair and beating up other dudes in a medieval Chinese setting, this is for you. So that'll be fun. After I finish that, I've got a shortish thing after that. That's only going to be like 2-3 more streams, I think. It's not going to be very many more. I've got another thing planned right after that, and then I'll probably use Wednesdays to pick up the slack to get through Instantiation a bit quicker, because most of the short stories in this are relatively short. We'll see how far along I am in it by the time I get there, and we'll figure it out. Because the one I'm planning to do right after A Hero Born is the thing I'm planning to do there is pretty short. That should not take very long to get through. In fact, I'm probably going to have to dedicate like an entire stream just to most of the book is like preamble and introduction, which I'm probably just going to do after the fact, to be honest, because you don't need to do it right before to gain any additional understanding, but it's pretty lengthy. So we'll get through that. That won't take very long. That'll be 2, maybe 3 streams, 3 weeks. So figure math. Anyway, where were we? So yeah, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, or UTC -5. I'm gonna get that into my stream descriptions. Yeah, I gotta do that. I am completely losing the plot today. I'm so sorry. Because I've got a lot of things on my mind at the moment. Actually, I don't, and that's the problem. I did have a lot of things on my mind, and now I'm having to recalibrate and be like, no, you did that. That's done. That's done. You don't have to do that now. You don't have to do that now. You have to worry about this other thing you have to do, but you don't have to worry about that thing. Anyway, yeah, that'll about do it. Thanks again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane, and if you want to watch these after the fact, they're all on the YouTube. I already did that. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. That is the way. At any rate, see you all later. Thanks again. Bye. And I try not to let these be quite this rough, but it's been a long week. So there. Alrighty. Until next time. Bye. Have a good one.